Hello there, my name is Cameron Canepa, and for this vlog I will be talking about the third book in the Harry Potter series, which is entitled Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. So a little bit of background, I actually am a huge fan of Harry Potter. For Koinonia last year, which is our freshman orientation, my K family was actually Harry Potter, which was so fun. I am a Ravenclaw, and I call myself a sort of veteran of Harry Potter. I've seen all the movies and I'm a huge fan of the franchise, but I've never read all the books. Previously, I had actually read books 1 and 2, and I had read part of 3, so it was pretty cool that we were able to pick up on book 3 in this class, and I'm hoping that this summer I'll be able to finish the rest of the series before I go to optometry school. So I'm excited for this read, and I'm excited to talk more about the book, and also I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the differences between the books and the movie, specifically this book and movie. So yeah, I will catch up here in a little while, and I look forward to talking about it. So, Chapter 1 of Prisoner of Azkaban begins midnight on Harry Potter's 13th birthday. He doesn't really think much of it because his whole life, his birthday has been insignificant. The Dursleys never really cared about his birthday. They never really cared about him getting older. Everything was always just about their son. And so Harry doesn't really think of anything about it. Though he does reflect a little bit about his parents' death, and he's glad to have made it to the age of 13. So Harry then hears some flapping at his window, and he looks out and he realizes that he can see Hedwig, which is his owl, and then another owl, which he doesn't recognize, and then a third owl called Errol, which is Ron Weasley's family's owl. And the three owls are carrying lots of birthday cards and wishes from Ron and from Hermione. It has gifts, and Harry's really excited because he never received birthday presents, and so that night when he went to bed, he was excited to celebrate his birthday because it was the first time that his birthday was ever even recognized by anyone. So included in these gifts, from Ron, he gets a pocket sneakoscope and a letter that talks about his family's trip to Egypt. From Hermione, he gets a broom servicing kit, which is good because Harry plays Quidditch, which is played on the brooms. And then from Hagrid, he gets a book called The Monster Book of Monsters. And then the last thing that he receives in the mail is a permission slip that he has to get signed by the school or by his parents from the school in order to go visit Hogsmeade. And that's an important part of the book later on, but we'll get into that here in a little while. So when Aunt Marge arrives, she's just loving so much on Dudley and talking about how amazing he is, and Harry's trying to be the very best, on his very best behavior as possible, because even though he wasn't very happy about it, Uncle Vernon did agree to his previous question about the permission slip for Hogsmeade. However, Aunt Marge is terrible to Harry, and so Harry's doing his very best to respond in ways that Uncle Vernon thinks are kind and responsible, because he really wants that permission slip to get signed. And so one night at dinner, Aunt Marge is talking about how horrible Harry's parents were, and Harry's anger causes her glass to break. And no one realizes it at the time, but Harry knows that that's what it was. And so from that point on, he tried really hard to be on his best behavior. But then there was another night where Aunt Marge was just talking about how Harry's parents were irresponsible enough to get themselves killed in a car crash, because Aunt Marge doesn't know about the wizarding world. And this causes Harry to get so upset, and he uses magic to blow up Aunt Marge into a big balloon, and she floats onto the ceiling of the room, which is quite hysterical as a reader. And this is actually one of the points where there was a difference between the book and the movie. In the book, Aunt Marge just floats up to the ceiling and gets stuck up there. However, in the movie, Aunt Marge floats out of the house, and she's floating off into the sky. And later on, there's actually mention that she was seen floating around a chimney. And so, in the book, like I said, she just gets stuck on the ceiling of the room. But in the movie, she just floats on, and we don't actually really ever know what happened to her. So at the end of chapter 2, Harry is running away, and he's gone upstairs to pack all of his things, and Uncle Vernon is yelling at him and trying to get him to stop, but Harry starts threatening him with his wand, and so Vernon lets him go, and so Harry is running away from number 4 Privet Drive. So at the start of chapter 3, Harry has officially run away from the Dursley home, and he's not sure where to go next. He's pretty nervous that he's going to get expelled from Hogwarts because wizards aren't supposed to practice magic outside of the school, and he most definitely did when he blew Aunt Marge up into a balloon. So he doesn't really know where to go, and he's kind of scared because he's alone, and it's in the middle of the night, it's dark, and he feels like he's being watched by a dark figure. However, there is a bus that comes up to him called the Night Bus, and that's spelled with a K, not just N-I-G-H-T, but K-N-I-G-H-T. And so the Night Bus is a hitchhiking service for wizards in need. And so because Harry is afraid he's going to get in trouble, when the conductor asks what his name is, he tells him Neville Longbottom, which was really funny to me because Neville, bless his heart, he is one of the other students at Hogwarts, and he is quite the character. In my experience from watching the movies, he's just this quirky little shy kid, and he's pretty innocent, and he always seems to be getting himself into trouble. Also, to hide his identity, Harry swooped his bangs over to cover his scar, because basically everyone in the wizarding world knows who Harry Potter is, because he was the boy who was chosen, and he is the one who was attacked by Voldemort as a baby, and so everyone knows who he is. So while Harry's on the bus, he hears more conversation about Sirius Black. He finds out that he was a prisoner in Azkaban, which is the prison for wizards. And he learns that he was there for 12 years and that he was a follower of Voldemort. And so in the book, we get a little bit of a glimpse into it. In the movie, it's a pretty cool scene where we see just that the bus can go through little tiny alleyways, and they're kind of getting tossed around, but it's a pretty interesting scene. It's one that I really enjoy in the movie. So the bus makes its way to Diagon Alley, which if you've seen the other movies or read the other books, you know that Harry was trying to go to Diagon Alley one time in the flue of the Weasley fireplace, and he didn't enunciate correctly. He said diagonally instead of Diagon Alley. So that's something I always think of when I hear Diagon Alley. And so Harry gets off the bus, and he is greeted by Cornelius Fudge, who is the Minister of Magic. And so Harry's afraid that he's going to be getting in trouble because of what he did to his aunt. However, Cornelius Fudge expresses that he's glad that Harry is okay, and he tells him that his aunt was deflated back to her normal size. And so Harry this whole time is confused as to why Cornelius isn't getting him in trouble. So Cornelius Fudge takes Harry to dinner, and then he takes him to the Leaky Cauldron, which is like a hotel, and he tells Harry he can stay there until school starts. So So, chapter 4 of this novel, Harry has been staying at the Leaky Cauldron, and he's just enjoying his time wandering around Diagon Alley. He goes and or he works on some homework. He goes and visits a shop where he gets some ice cream. He goes and looks at a Quidditch supply store, and he's just having a grand old time. During this time, Harry also goes and buys his books for his third year of school, which is about to begin, and he's startled because he sees a book that has a big black dog on the front of it, and the dog that he sees reminds him of that dark figure that he saw when he was getting on the night bus. And so all of this is foreshadowing as to what's going to happen soon. So about this time, Harry reunites with Ron and Hermione, and they go to a pet store because Ron has a rat named Scabbers, and he's an old, real sickly looking rat, and so Ron was trying to buy some rat tonic for him. And while they were in the store, there was a cat that attacked Scabbers, and come to find out that Hermione decided to buy that cat, and his name is Crookshanks. So then we see the trio joining Ron's family at their home for dinner. We see all the different siblings, Fred and George being goofballs, making everybody laugh, Percy being kind of snooty like he usually is, Jenny being shy but enjoying the fun. And then we see later after dinner that Mr. and Mrs. Weasley are talking, and Harry overhears that they're talking about Sirius Black and how he escaped Azkaban, and everyone suspects that it has something to do with Harry. However, Harry's not super afraid. He feels very safe whenever he is at Hogwarts, and he knows that he has encountered Voldemort twice before, so he's not too scared of Sirius Black. So, chapter 5 begins with the trio and the other magical siblings being picked up by Ministry of Magic cars, and they are taken to the King's Cross station, where they enter platform 9 3/4, which takes them to the Hogwarts Express. And so they are all headed back to Hogwarts for Harry, Ron, and Hermione's third year of school. So right before they get onto the Hogwarts Express, Ron's dad pulls Harry aside and tells him not to go looking for Sirius Black because Mr. Weasley knows how Harry is. He always wants to save the day, but he also knows how dangerous Sirius Black can be, and he doesn't want Harry to get in trouble. So whenever they get on the train, Harry tells the trio about what's going on with Sirius Black. He tells them about the things they know, and they're in their own car, and the only other person in there is a sleeping, kind of raggedy looking man, and his briefcase says R.J. Lupin, and Hermione tells them that he is their new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. So after they've stopped talking about Sirius Black, they start to talk about Hogsmeade, which Harry's feeling pretty defeated because he still doesn't have his permission slip signed. And then here pretty soon comes Harry's nemesis, Draco Malfoy. And Draco's being rude about how poor Ron's family is because of how terrible his rat Scabbers looks. But then he sees that Professor Lupin is there, so he leaves them alone. And pretty soon after that, the Hogwarts Express stops and all the lights go out. So then they see this dark, shadowy figure come around the corner, and Harry feels this terrible aching cold. He sees a dark, silvery, corpse-looking hand, and he can hear a woman screaming. And all of this causes Harry to pass out. And so after he awakes, he is surrounded by Ron and Hermione and Professor Lupin. And Professor Lupin tells him that that was a Dementor. And he says that they are the guards of Azkaban. And Lupin used a Patronus, which the students don't know about yet. But then Professor Lupin offers Harry some chocolate, and he says he needs to eat it because it will make him feel better, which I think is funny because it's like, oh, here's some chocolate. It'll make you feel better. But anyways, so then when they get to Hogwarts, they see Professor McGonagall, and she wants to check up on Harry, make sure he's okay, and then she pulls Hermione aside to talk about something in private, which again is more foreshadowing to something that we learn about much later in this novel. So after this conversation with McGonagall, they all go back into the Great Hall for dinner, and they see Professor Dumbledore, who announces that there will be Dementors surrounding the castle of Hogwarts, and that is to keep the students safe from Sirius Black. Then he does a couple of announcements where we learn for sure that Lupin is the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. And we also learned that Hagrid will now be the new Care of Magical Teachers, the new Care of Magical Creatures teacher. And so they're eating, and Harry is very excited to be back at Hogwarts, which he feels like is his true home. All right, so the next morning, Harry's getting ready for class, and Malfoy and the Slytherins are still bugging him about what happened with the Dementors, but he just does his best to ignore them. And they realize that Hermione is signed up for 3 classes at 9 o'clock. But Ron asks her about it, and she just quickly changes the subject. So he's like, okay, whatever. That doesn't make sense, but you do you. So then the trio starts to head their way to divination class, and they're actually taken to the classroom by a knight named Sir Cadogan. Cadogan? I'm not sure. But then they're in divination class, and here we see Professor Trelawney, and she makes some predictions about the future. She's kind of I don't know, she's just kind of a strange professor, and people are kind of wary about her predictions sometimes. But in this day of divination class, they are drinking tea, and she's going to try to interpret the leftover tea leaves. And so Hermione and Ron are just kind of goofing off. But then Professor Trelawney comes and looks at Harry's cup, and she sees a black dog, and she tells him that he has the Grim, which is a black dog who roams the premises. And so everyone's kind of weary about that because it's a death omen. And so everyone starts to leave divination class. But then they go to transformation with Professor McGonagall, where she assures Harry that he'll be fine. She says that Professor Trelawney is always making a prediction, at least one student a year, that they're going to die. And she says that she's never been right yet. So that little yet, I think, makes Harry a little nervous. But I think he just tries to kind of go on about his day and ignore that death omen that he saw. So after transformation class with Professor McGonagall, the students move on to Care of Magical Creatures with Hagrid, their new professor. And so Hagrid introduces them to a group of animals called hippogriffs, which are, let me make sure I'm getting this correctly. Yes, they are half horse and half eagle, which is super cool. This is actually the animal that appears on the cover of the novel if you have the traditional novel covers. And so you know that this is going to be an important part of the story. So Harry volunteers to approach a hippogriff, and his name is Buckbeak. And so Hagrid teaches him how to respectfully bow to the hippogriff before he mounts it and gets to fly. And so this is another difference that we see from the book to the movie. In the book, it's just a pretty simple ride around the Forbidden Forest. But in the movie, it's really a cool scene where we see him flying all around, and Harry even lets go at one point and just soars on Buckbeak's back, and it's a big deal in the movie. But in the book, it actually says that Harry prefers to ride on a broomstick than the hippogriff. So Harry just experienced a pretty magical ride on the back of a hippogriff, and Malfoy decides that it's his turn. And instead of doing the respectful bow and doing what Hagrid says, Malfoy starts to taunt the hippogriff, and so Buckbeak bites him. So Hagrid had to take Malfoy to the hospital wing, and Harry is pretty nervous because he knows the damage that Draco can do. So some of this damage is that Draco has been bragging to all his friends that because of what happened with Buckbeak, that he's going to have his father, he's threatening to have his father remove Hagrid from his job, even though it was Draco's fault and not Hagrid's. So the night of the Hippogriff incident, the trio go to visit Hagrid, and he is a mess. He's drunk, and he's crying, and he's so upset about what happened with the Hippogriff. But then all of a sudden he's like, Harry, you shouldn't be wandering around at night. It's not safe for you. And so he escorts the trio back to the castle and tells them not to come out at night. And this is another foreshadowing about Sirius Black that we'll talk about here pretty soon. He's coming. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, this is one of my favorite chapters. I love the part whenever Harry's riding on the back of Buckbeak, especially in the movie. It's one of my favorite scenes. You just see Harry, he's just full of pure joy, and he just is finally feeling free, and he's just able to enjoy himself, even just for a few minutes. So chapter 7 was definitely one of my favorite, if not my favorite chapter of this novel. It is The Boggart in the Wardrobe. And so it starts, we see Malfoy being his dramatic little self with his arm all bandaged, and he goes to potions class, and he just sits there because he's like, oh, I can't do anything, my arm hurts. And so Professor Snape is the potions professor, and first he gets mad at Neville because he got his potions confused. Then he gets onto Hermione for trying to help Neville. And so they never really have a very positive experience when Snape is their professor. While potions class is going on, Malfoy is bragging again to his Slytherin friends about his father's influence on Hagrid's job, and Harry's mad again because he's become very defensive of Hagrid in this novel. But then Malfoy says another thing about revenge on Sirius Black, and so this is another time where Harry hears about Sirius Black and wonders who he is and why everyone's making such a big deal about him. So after potions class, Harry, Hermione, and Ron are walking upstairs when Hermione disappears, and then the boys see her again behind them rushing down the stairs, which they're not sure about, but that is a bit of foreshadowing, which we'll learn about soon. So then they head into Defense Against the Dark Arts with, I cannot say that name, Defense Against the Dark Arts with Professor Lupin, and he tells them that there's going to be a boggart. And so as the students come in, they encounter Snape, who says something rude to Neville. And so Lupin says that he wants Neville to go first to fight the boggart. So what the boggart is it is a sort of spirit, I would say, that transforms into whoever is encountering it. It turns into their biggest fear. And so Neville's biggest fear is Professor Snape. However, Professor Lupin teaches the class that if they use the ridiculous spell, that their biggest fear is turned into something humorous. So he tells Neville to picture his aunt, and when he performs the ridiculous spell, we see that Snape is turned into, he's now dressed as an old woman with a big hat with feathers and a dress, and all the students just think that that is so funny. So in the book, we see that Hermione's boggart is being seen as a failure by Professor McGonagall, but this is not shown in the movie, so there's another discrepancy that we see. Ron's boggart took the form of a giant spider. Neville's was Severus Snape, which we already talked about. In the books, Dean Thomas's boggart was a living hand. Again, that was not seen in the movies. We see also in the book that Parvati's was a mummy. Again, another one that was omitted from the movie. Padma Patil's was a giant cobra. Seamus Finnegan's was a banshee. And so there's lots of different ones that we see in the book, though they're not all included in the movie. And then Harry does not get a turn because he knew something of Harry's was very a dark fear, and he didn't want to invite, Voldemort, Sirius Black, a Dementor, any of those very scary things into the classroom. So after the class experienced the Boggarts, basically all the students at Hogwarts started to love Defense Against the Art. I always mess that up. Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Everyone loves it except for Malfoy, and of course Malfoy has to have something wrong with it, and he's always talking about how grubby Lupin's robes look and how they just don't look new, and they just look old and worn out. So Harry is on the Quidditch team, and his team begins to practice because pretty soon will be the Hogwarts Cup. It's also close to Halloween, which is when the first trip to Hogsmeade is going to happen. Harry is still very upset. Again, he still does not have that permission slip that says he gets to go to Hogsmeade. Ron and Hermione feel bad because Harry can't go, but they promise that they're going to bring him sweets. This is one of the only times that we really see Harry and Ron get along. No, not Harry and Ron. Hermione and Ron, because most of the time they're arguing because Crookshanks keeps attacking Scabbers the rat. So while the students all get to go to Hogsmeade and Harry has to stay behind, Professor Lupin decides to invite Harry to his office for tea. And Harry asks Professor Lupin, hey, why didn't I get to fight the Boggart? And Professor Lupin confirms what I said earlier. He says that he didn't want Voldemort to be invited into the classroom. And Harry tells Professor Lupin that he is more afraid of the Dementors than he is Voldemort. And Professor Lupin says that he is afraid of fear itself. And he says that that is a very he says that suggests that what you fear the most of all is fear. Very wise, Harry. That is a direct quote from the book. Then Snape comes into the office and he brings a goblet which Lupin begins to drink from. But Harry is kind of wary of this because he's afraid that Snape is trying to poison Lupin so that he can have his job. But all turns out fine. Even though Harry tries to tell Lupin subtly without Professor Snape knowing. So the students come back from Hogsmeade, and Ron and Hermione bring Harry a big bag of candy, and they just talk about the trip and how fun it was. And of course, Harry is kind of defeated about that, but the trio and the rest of the students attend the Halloween feast. And when they're on their way back to the Gryffindor Tower, they're horrified because they see that the portrait of the fat lady has been slashed. She's the portrait that hangs at the entrance of the Gryffindor Tower, and the fat lady is gone from the portrait. And so there's a poltergeist named Peeves, and he tells the students that Sirius Black is the one who attacked the fat lady. I thought it was funny whenever I first saw that this chapter was called The Flight of the Fat Lady, because I feel like it was kind of a playback to when Harry made his aunt fly. He turned her into a fat lady and made her fly. So when I first saw that that was the name of the chapter before I began reading the book, I assumed that that was going to be the chapter which his aunt was flying, but turns out it wasn't. So after Sirius Black breaks into the castle, all the students sleep in the Great Hall, and the professors all go searching the Hogwarts castle to see if they can find Sirius Black. They don't find anything, and Sir Cadogan replaces the fat lady at the entrance of the Gryffindor corridor, and he's really enjoying himself trying to trick the Gryffindors and give them really tough riddles to get into the main hall. So the next day, it's pretty bad weather outside, but the Gryffindors have a Quidditch tournament that they're supposed to play against the Hufflepuffs. And that morning before the Quidditch match, Harry goes to Defense Against the Dark Arts class and sees that Professor Snape is substituting instead of Professor Lupin. So at the Quidditch match, Harry and Cedric Diggory, who is the Hufflepuff seeker, are searching around for the golden snitch, but they can't see anything. So then Harry catches, he sees the large black dog that he always sees, and then he sees the snitch. He goes to grab it, and he sees hundreds of Dementors surrounding the field, and he feels that cold feeling again and the screams of his mother, Lily. When Harry wakes up in the hospital wing, he finds out that Cedric ended up catching the golden snitch, which means that the Hufflepuffs won, and his broom fell into the Whomping Willow, which destroyed it. So the next chapter is about the Marauders map, which comes from Fred and George, and they give it to Harry. And on this map, when you say the phrase, "I solemnly swear I'm up to no good," the map opens up and you can see the location of all the wizards in the castle. It's signed by 4 people, Padfoot, Prongs, Moony, and Wormtail. And so Harry is using this to navigate his way underneath the school. So then Harry reunites with his friends and they go to a place called Three Broomsticks Pub, where they have butterbeer, which is a common drink in this movie. It's pretty cool. Apparently you can get it if you go to Harry Potter World, which I'd love to go there someday. So anyway, so while they're in the pub, a bunch of their professors come in and start talking about Sirius Black, and another name is mentioned, which is Peter Pettigrew, and he becomes an important character very soon in this novel. So at this point, Harry is very upset because due to the conversation he overheard, he now believes that Sirius Black played a role in the murder of his parents. Ron knows that Harry is going to want to try to seek revenge on Sirius Black, but he tries to talk him out of it because he knows how dangerous it can be. To try to distract Harry, the trio goes to visit Hagrid. However, this visit's not a very happy one because they find out from Hagrid that Buckbeak, which is the hippogriff that attacked Malfoy, is scheduled to go on trial in April, and he's going to potentially be executed. So now it is Christmas Day, and Harry wakes up, and in his pile of presents he finds a firebolt broomstick, and he's super excited because his other one was destroyed, but Hermione's afraid that it has something to do with Sirius Black, so she reports it to Professor McGonagall, and Professor McGonagall takes it away for observation to make sure that it doesn't have anything to do with Sirius Black. So in chapter 12, now that Harry has been knocked out by Dementors twice, Professor Lupin is going to try to teach him the Patronus, how to cast a Patronus. And so he does this by using the spell Expecto Patronum, and you have to think of a happy thought in order to do this. So Harry tries to conjure up the happiest thoughts he can, but his Patronus is still weak. And so Professor Lupin gives him chocolate again, which I just think is so funny that that's part of his character, but I love it. Also, we see Oliver Wood, who is on the Quidditch team. He's the captain of the Gryffindor team. He's begging for Harry to have his new broomstick back, and we see towards the end of the chapter that McGonagall does give Harry his broomstick back, and everyone's so excited about it. Also in this chapter, Harry learns more information about the Dementors and how they administered the kiss to take the soul out of someone. And Harry is told that the Minister of Magic has given the Dementors permission to give the kiss to Sirius Black should he be found. At the close of this chapter, we find that Ron has discovered that his rat Scabbers is missing, and there was some blood and red cat hair on his bed, so he is convinced that Hermione's cat Crookshanks has killed Scabbers the rat. So chapter 13 is a fun chapter. We see that the Gryffindor team is playing against the Ravenclaw, which I'm excited because that's my house. And so we just see some about Harry taking Ron for a ride and just them practicing and preparing for the match. And so during the match, Harry sees the golden snitch, and so he starts to go after it, but he sees what he believes are 3 Dementors at the bottom. So he tries to cast the Patronus spell on them. So then he catches the snitch and the Gryffindors win, but he later discovers that those 3 Dementors were actually Malfoy and 2 of his friends trying to mess with Harry. Professor McGonagall does get them in trouble, as this was not a very nice thing for them to do. So that night, the Gryffindors return to their corridor to celebrate, and once they go to bed, Ron eventually wakes up Harry with a scream saying that Sirius Black slashed the curtains on his bed. And when McGonagall asks Sir Cadogan if he let anyone in, he says yes, that the person who came in had all the passwords written on the door, or on a piece of paper, so he didn't know what the issue was. And we find out that Neville Longbottom had written down the passwords because he had a terrible memory, and so he wrote down the passwords and accidentally left them out, and that the intruder had found them. So because of this second break-in, the security at Hogwarts increases, and no one tells Neville the passwords. So one day, Ron and Harry go visit Hagrid, and he tells them that they should stop holding a grudge against Hermione. So the wizards are going to Hogsmeade again, and this time, instead of staying at Hogwarts, Harry gets to sneak in by using his invisibility cloak. So the boys are having fun, and underneath his security cloak, Harry kicks mud at Malfoy, and Malfoy decides to go report it to Snape, which of course made Snape angry. So Snape starts to get onto Harry. Harry yells at Snape to shut up, which makes him even more mad. Snape tells Harry to empty his pockets, and he finds the Marauders map. Lupin is able to convince Snape that this was just a joke from Zonko's joke shop, and Ron joins in and says, "Oh yeah, I bought that for Harry a long time ago." So Snape lets them go, but Lupin warns them that they need to be more careful and that someone could be trying to lure them out of the castle with the map. At the end of the chapter, Hermione comes and tells Ron and Harry that unfortunately Buckbeak has lost the case and he's going to be executed. In chapter 15, the trio makes up. Hermione apologizes to Ron about losing Scabbers, and they go back to normal. But the boys have started to notice that Hermione is exhausted. She started being late to classes, and so they're not sure what's going on with her. But it's a crazy time in their school. They're about to take their final exams for the year, and the Quidditch Cup is coming close. And of course, guess who's playing? It's Gryffindor versus Slytherin, which means that it's Harry as the seeker for Gryffindor versus Malfoy for the seeker for Slytherin. So at the end of the cup, Harry is successful in beating Malfoy, and the Gryffindors win the Hogwarts Cup, and Harry thinks to himself that with all the happiness that he's feeling, he feels like he could conjure up a very impressive Patronus. So one of the most important parts of this chapter is that Professor Trelawney is overtaken. It's almost like she's possessed, and she has a prediction that the Dark Lord will reunite with Harry that night. But then whenever she snaps out of it, she has no recollection of telling him this. So obviously, that makes Harry a little bit afraid. However, before Harry can tell anybody, he finds out that Buckbeak is going to be executed that night. The trio goes and tries to console Hagrid, and so they took the invisibility cloak, and they found that Lucius Malfoy was there, and he was threatening Hagrid. And then Hermione was refilling a milk jug and she found Scabbers, and so Ron was excited to have his rat back. But whenever they were going back to the castle, they heard a chop of an axe, which they assumed was the killing of Buckbeak. So a lot of things happen in this chapter, but the most important things are we find out that Sirius Black's not who everybody thinks he is. We found out that he and Lupin are friends, and we find out that the four that are on the Marauders map, Wormtail is Peter Pettigrew, which is Ron's rat. Moony is Professor Lupin, who is a werewolf. Padfoot is Sirius Black, who is the black dog, and Prongs was James Potter, which is Harry's dad. Crookshanks is the one that led the trio to the Shrieking Shack, which is where they ended up finding Sirius Black. At first they thought Lupin was a traitor, but then after some explanation and them having to use the Expelliarmus spell on the trio so they don't kill Sirius, they find out the truth. In this chapter, we really just learn more about the Marauders. Hermione asks why they are Animagi when there are only 7 registered, and they admit that they weren't registered Animagi. But we just find out more about their background, how they created the Marauders map, and at the end of the chapter, we see that Snape was in the corner listening in, and he had on Harry's invisibility cloak. In this chapter, they're trying to decide what to do with Peter Pettigrew. Ultimately, they decide to tie him up and take him back to Hogwarts, though they were prepared to kill him. But Harry said that he doesn't think James would want them to become murderers. Snape is upset and threatens to kill Sirius. However, the trio, all 3, use the Expelliarmus spell, and they end up knocking him out. So they also bring him back to Hogwarts. So in this chapter, Harry learns that Sirius Black is actually his godfather, and he just learns more about their background. Lupin ends up turning into a werewolf because it's a full moon. In all the chaos, Peter grabs Lupin's wand, turns himself back into a rat, and escapes. He also uses the stupefy spell on Ron, and so it's just a pretty chaotic part. So Harry and Hermione see that Ron is unconscious. They find out that he's okay. However, they look over and see that Sirius Black is being attacked by Dementors. They're trying to use their Patronuses to get them away, but they're not quite strong enough. And so Harry starts to feel the effect that he usually gets from the Dementors. But in the distance, he sees a bright white animal that he feels like looks like his dad, and he thinks that's who it is. And it's a Patronus, and it ends up saving Sirius Black from the Dementors. So in chapter 21, we learn the secret of how Hermione's been attending 3 classes at the same time. She has something called a time turner, which was given to her by Professor Dumbledore. So Dumbledore comes into the hospital wing and tells Hermione that she has a chance to save 2 lives that night. Those 2 lives being Sirius Black and Buckbeak. This scene is definitely played up more in the movie than it was in the book, but basically we learned that they were able to use the time turner to go back, though they had to keep themselves a secret from their present day selves, and they were able to go back and save Buckbeak. And it turns out that the axe that they heard was a thud of frustration because Buckbeak had escaped. So then Harry realizes that the Patronus he thought was his dad's was actually his own, so he was able to conjure a Patronus and save Sirius Black. He realizes that his Patronus, like his dad's, is a stag. And so Harry and Hermione hop on Buckbeak and they go up to where Sirius Black is staying. So in chapter 22, it's called Outpost Again. So we find out that Buckbeak escaped and Sirius Black was able to escape with him. And so the two lives were saved that night. And Lupin decides to go ahead and quit his job at Hogwarts. He feels that it's not safe for him to be around students when he has his werewolf transformation. So decided to let Peter Pettigrew free. And then on the Hogwarts Express, on their way back home, Hermione says that she's going to take a normal amount of classes the next semester. And Ron is making plans for Harry to come visit him and his family. And Harry feels relieved because he knows that anytime he needs to get anything out of his uncle and his cousin, he can throw out the name Sirius Black and they'll basically do whatever he wants. But he's looking forward to the next time that he gets to come back to Hogwarts. So I really enjoyed this novel. I feel like it stayed really true to the book, or to the movie stayed really true to the book. And it was awesome to continue reading the Harry Potter series, and I look forward to reading more. I hope you've enjoyed this vlog and my narrations and thoughts on it. It was a great experience, and I am so glad that we got to do this. Bye!